What is your name in Spanish? Technically, it stays the same in any language, but on a practical level, the issue is a little bit more complicated. When you're traveling, you might want to consider changing your name. You might want to have an extra alias in a second language to make things easier for people. So today we're going to talk about the controversial subject of changing your name in another language, whether you should, what you should change it to, if you should, the reasons why you might want to consider it, etc. Hey there, Jim here from Spanish and Go, your resource for learning real-world travel Spanish, and this is where we talk about the culture of Spanish-speaking countries, the traditions, the language, of course, and today the topic of whether you should change your name in Spanish. So I think this is an important topic for any language learner because your name is one of the first things that comes up when you're traveling anywhere. Whether you're getting a bus ticket or making your way around, you'll often have these small talk conversations where you have to introduce yourself. And what it comes down to is your name isn't really all about you. This is about the ease of having people understand what they should call you and how to get them to be able to address you in a way that isn't twisting your regular name, right? So in Spanish, if I tell people my name is Jim, often I'll get Jim if I'm lucky. Oftentimes, people won't even remember that name because it's not a common name in Spanish. Before I went to Mexico for the first time, I had this idea that I would change my name, but it really became practical when I started traveling in Mexico with my wife, the other half of Spanish and Go on this channel here. And I noticed when we were getting our bus tickets, every time I told them my name in English, Jim Fricker, they would grab the keyboard and hand it over to me. It was hilarious because they just had no idea how to write that down. And maybe, especially my last name isn't extremely common, but it's obvious that they would be confused because in Spanish, you won't hear a name like Jim Fricker. It's not a traditional Spanish name by any means. So I quickly switched over to Jaime Fernandez. And that made all the difference because instantly people knew exactly how to spell my name. They would no longer hand the keyboard over to me to write it down for my bus ticket. They knew exactly how to spell Jaime Fernandez. And the same went for meeting other people in Spanish. People just know Jaime. It's easy to remember because it's a common name in Spanish. This just makes things so much easier for native Spanish speakers to be able to address you in a way that they're comfortable with, it's a familiar name, and they know how to pronounce it. Now, if the idea of changing your name sounds strange to you, consider this. You probably already have multiple names. Consider what your friends call you versus what your colleagues at work call you, or maybe what people used to call you on a sports team, or what your family calls you, or what your spouse calls you. You probably have names of endearment, depending on the relationship you have with different people. So it's not really a foreign concept to have these sort of separate identities in a way. And I think it's a lot of fun to continue on with that idea when you're learning a new language. You basically get to take on a new persona. Now, a lot of people who speak multiple languages will tell you that they feel like they have a different personality when they're speaking a new language. And I kind of feel the same way. In Spanish, I feel like my identity is much more Mexican. I tend to use more Mexican slang. I feel like I'm less shy and I'm much more excited to share my love of Mexico with other Mexicans that I meet. Things like how much I love spicy food, or I know exactly how many tacos I can eat. Things of that nature, because it just makes me feel like I can relate more with other Mexicans, putting out that side of me, the fact that I have a lot in common with them. And changing my name just makes it a little bit easier to connect with people in Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries. So whether you change your name in Spanish is completely up to you. It's absolutely optional. But if you're with me so far, I want to give you some tips of what you might want to consider calling yourself in Spanish. Now, I already mentioned that I changed my name from Jim Fricker or James Fricker to Jaime Fernandez, and you can probably see the obvious connection there. I'm basically trying to translate as closely as possible Jim or James to Spanish. And one tip I have for doing this is to consult some online name lists in Spanish. You can simply search for men's names in Spanish and look down a list. And if your name doesn't directly translate, you can find names that might be similar. Some names like Maria obviously don't need much changing, but other names like Jacob might switch to Jacobo, for example. But if your name is already sort of odd in English, you can pretty much just choose whatever name you feel like fits you or suits you in Spanish. When I first started learning Spanish, I actually started calling myself Santiago. Now that might sound like a far cry from James, but I saw the King James version of the Bible was translated as the Santiago version in Spanish. So I thought, okay, well, I guess James is Santiago. But later when I met Mai, she basically convinced me that it made more sense to go with Jaime. But what we're really trying to get here is for people to have something to call you by so that you don't obviously stick out as a foreigner immediately and start getting bombarded with questions about where you're from and your history and all that, unless that's the conversation you want to have. But if you're really just trying to get through like a quick transaction, like the bus ticket example I gave earlier, it's easier to just go by a different name. So let's go over a few common objections about why you might not want to change your name. Now, I think first and foremost, people will say, well, my name is my identity. My name is who I am. And you might feel like you don't have to accommodate anyone. But I guess that's okay if you're okay with people probably saying your name wrong. But this is where I wanted to talk about how your name isn't really about you in Spanish. This is really about what you want people to call you to make it easier for them to address you and to say your name correctly. Now, my mother-in-law, she calls me Jim, and I've just sort of taken it on as like another name of endearment. My mother-in-law calls me Jim, and that's just the way it is. She's never called me Jaime, but Mai, on the other hand, always calls me Jaime, at least when we're speaking Spanish. But this is really about making it easier for Spanish speakers to address you and to basically feel like they have a little bit more in common with you, because I think even in English, when somebody introduces themselves with a very foreign name, our immediate thought is, where are you from? What's your background? This and that. And that's fine if that's a conversation you want to get into. But I think most of the time we strive to maybe fit in a little bit more, and changing your name helps you do that. And you can always get into your whole backstory at a later date if you feel like you're really hitting it off with the person that you just met. So in conclusion, yes, changing your name in Spanish is completely optional, and your name is your name in any language. But if you want to make things easier for native speakers, then you might want to consider changing your name and having a little fun by creating a new identity for yourself in your new language. But I would love to know in the comments if you have an alternate name in Spanish, or if you're thinking about one, go ahead and just drop a comment below. I would love to hear you guys' answers. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more travel and Spanish tips. And remember, el camino es el destino. The journey is the destination. Nos vemos pronto.